Around the World in 80 Days. Around the World in 80 Days is an adventure novel by the French writer Jules Verne, first published in French in 1872. In the story, Phileas Fogg of London and his newly employed French valet Passepartout attempt to circumnavigate the world in 80 days on a wager £20,000 set by his friends at the Reform Club. It is one of Verne's most acclaimed works. Phileas Fogg is a wealthy English gentleman living a solitary life in London. Despite his wealth, Fogg lives modestly and carries out his habits with mathematical precision. Very little can be said about his social life other than that he is a member of the Reform Club, where he spends the best part of his days. Having dismissed his valet for bringing him shaving water at a temperature slightly lower than expected, Fogg hires Frenchman Jean Passepartout as a replacement. On the evening of the 2nd of October 1872, while at the Reform Club, Fogg gets involved in an argument over an article in the Daily Telegraph stating that with the opening of a new railway section in India, it is now possible to travel around the world in 80 days. He accepts a wager for £20,000, half of his total fortune, from his fellow club members to complete such a journey within this time period. With Passepartout accompanying him, Fogg departs from London by train at 8:45 p.m. that same evening. In order to win the wager, he must return to the club by this same time on 21st of December, 80 days later. They take the remaining £20,000 of Fogg's fortune with them to cover expenses during the journey. Fogg and Passepartout reach Suez in time. While disembarking in Egypt, they are watched by a Scotland Yard policeman, Detective Fix, who has been dispatched from London in search of a bank robber. Since Fogg fits the vague description Scotland Yard was given of the robber, Detective Fix mistakes Fogg for the criminal. Since he cannot secure a warrant in time, Fix boards the steamer conveying the travellers to Bombay. Fix becomes acquainted with Passepartout without revealing his purpose. Fogg promises the steamer engineer a large reward if he gets them to Bombay early. They dock 2 days ahead of schedule. After reaching India, they take a train from Bombay to Calcutta. Fogg learns that the Daily Telegraph article was wrong. A 80-kilometer stretch of track from Colby to Allahabad has not yet been built. Fogg purchases an elephant, hires a guide, and starts toward Allahabad. They come across a procession in which a young Indian woman, Ayoda, is to undergo sati. Since she is drugged with opium and hemp and is obviously not going voluntarily, the travelers decide to rescue her. They follow the procession to the site, where Passepartout takes the place of Ayoda's deceased husband on the funeral pyre. During the ceremony he rises from the pyre, scaring off the priests, and carries Ayoda away. The 12 hours gained earlier are lost, but Fogg shows no regret. The travelers hasten to catch the train at the next railway station, taking Ayoda with them. At Calcutta, they board a steamer going to Hong Kong, with a day's stopover in Singapore. Fix has Fogg and Passepartout arrested. They jump bail and Fix follows them to Hong Kong. He shows himself to Passepartout, who is delighted to again meet his traveling companion from the earlier voyage. In Hong Kong, it turns out that Ayoda's distant relative, in whose care they had been planning to leave her, has moved to Holland, so they decide to take her with them to Europe. Still without a warrant, Fix sees Hong Kong as his last chance to arrest Fogg on British soil. Passepartout becomes convinced that Fix is a spy from the Reform Club. Fix confides in Passepartout, who does not believe a word and remains convinced that his master is not a bank robber. To prevent Passepartout from informing his master about the premature departure of their next vessel, the Carnatic, Fix gets Passepartout drunk and drugs him in an opium den. Passepartout still manages to catch the steamer to Yokohama, but is not able to inform Fogg that the steamer is leaving the evening before its scheduled departure date. Fogg discovers that he missed his connection. He searches for a vessel that will take him to Yokohama, finding a pilot boat, the Tankadier, that takes him and a Yoda to Shanghai, where they catch a steamer to Yokohama. In Yokohama, they search for Passepartout, believing that he arrived there on the Carnatic as originally planned. They find him in a circus, trying to earn the fare for his homeward journey. Reunited, the four board a paddle steamer, the General Grant, taking them across the Pacific to San Francisco. Fix promises Passepartout that now, having left British soil, he will no longer try to delay Fogg's journey, but instead support him in getting back to Britain so he can arrest Fogg in Britain itself. In San Francisco, they board a transcontinental train to New York, encountering a number of obstacles along the way. A massive herd of bison crossing the tracks, a failing suspension bridge, and a band of Sioux warriors ambushing the train. After uncoupling the locomotive from the carriages, Passepartout is kidnapped by the Indians, but Fogg rescues him after American soldiers volunteer to help. They continue by a wind-powered sledge to Omaha, where they get a train to New York. In New York, having missed the ship China, Fogg looks for alternative transport. He finds a steamboat, the Henrietta, destined for Bordeaux, France. The captain of the boat refuses to take the company to Liverpool, whereupon Fogg consents to be taken to Bordeaux for $2,000 per passenger. He then bribes the crew to mutiny and make course for Liverpool. Against hurricane winds and going on full steam, the boat runs out of fuel after a few days. Fogg buys the boat from the captain and has the crew burn all the wooden parts to keep up the steam. The companions arrive at Queenstown, Ireland, take the train to Dublin and then a ferry to Liverpool, still in time to reach London before the deadline. Once on English soil, Fix produces a warrant and arrests Fogg. A short time later, the misunderstanding is cleared up. The actual robber, an individual named James Strand, had been caught 3 days earlier in Edinburgh. However, Fogg has missed the train and arrives in London 5 minutes late, certain he has lost the wager. The following day Fogg apologizes to a Yoda for bringing her with him, since he now has to live in poverty and cannot support her. A Yoda confesses that she loves him and asks him to marry her. As Passepartout notifies a minister, he learns that he is mistaken in the date. It is not the 22nd of December, but instead the 21st of December. Because the party had traveled eastward, their days were shortened by 4 minutes for each of the 360 degrees of longitude they crossed. Thus, although they had experienced the same amount of time abroad as people had experienced in London, they had seen 80 sunrises and sunsets while London had seen only 79. Passepartout informs Fogg of his mistake, and Fogg hurries to the Reform Club just in time to meet his deadline and win the wager. Having spent almost £19,000 of his travel money during the journey, he divides the remainder between Passepartout and Fix and marries a Yoda. Around the World in 80 Days was written during difficult times, both for France and for Verne. It was during the Franco-Prussian War in which Verne was conscripted as a coast guard. He was having financial difficulties. His father had died recently, and he had witnessed a public execution, which had disturbed him. The technological innovations of the 19th century had opened the possibility of rapid circumnavigation, and the prospect fascinated Verne and his readership. In particular, 3 technological breakthroughs occurred in 1869-70 that made a tourist-like around-the-world journey possible for the first time. The completion of the first transcontinental railroad in America, the linking of the Indian railways across the subcontinent, and the opening of the Suez Canal. It was another notable mark in the end of an age of exploration and the start of an age of fully global tourism that could be enjoyed in relative comfort and safety. It sparked the imagination that anyone could sit down, draw up a schedule, buy tickets and travel around the world, a feat previously reserved for only the most heroic and hardy of adventurers. The closing date of the novel, the 21st of December 1872, was the same date as the serial publication. As it was being published serially for the first time, some readers believed that the journey was actually taking place, bets were placed, and some railway companies and ship liner companies lobbied Verne to appear in the book. It is unknown if Verne submitted to their requests, but the descriptions of some rail and shipping lines leave some suspicion he was influenced. Concerning the final coup de théâtre, Fogg had thought it was one day later than it actually was, because he had forgotten that during his journey, he had added a full day to his clock. At the rate of an hour per 15 degrees of longitude crossed. At the time of publication and until 1884, a de jure international dateline did not exist. If it did, he would have been made aware of the change in date once he reached this line. Thus, the day he added to his clock throughout his journey would be removed upon crossing this imaginary line. However, in the real world, Fogg's mistake would not have been likely to occur because a de facto dateline did exist. The UK, India and the US had the same calendar with different local times. He would have noticed, when he arrived in San Francisco, that the local date was actually one day earlier than shown in his travel diary. As a consequence, it is unlikely he would fail to notice that the departure dates of the transcontinental train in San Francisco and of the China steamer in New York were actually one day earlier than his personal travel diary. He would also somehow have to avoid looking at any newspapers. Additionally, in Who Betrays Elizabeth Bennet? John Sutherland points out that Fogg and company would have to be deaf, dumb and blind not to notice how busy the streets were on an apparent Sunday, with the Sunday Observance Act 1780 still in effect. Following publication in 1873, various people attempted to follow Fogg's fictional circumnavigation, often within self-imposed constraints. In 1889, Nellie Bly undertook to travel around the world in 80 days for her newspaper, The New York World. She managed to do the journey within 72 days, meeting Verne in Amiens. Her book Around the World in 72 Days became a bestseller. In 1903, James Willis Sayer, a Seattle theater critic and arts promoter, set a world record for circling the Earth using public transport, 54 days, 9 hours, and 42 minutes. In 1908, Harry Bensley, on a wager, set out to circumnavigate the world on foot wearing an iron mask. The journey was abandoned, incomplete, at the outbreak of World War I in 1914. In 1928, 15-year-old Danish Boy Scout Palle Huld traveled around the world by train and ship in the opposite direction to the one in the book. His trip was sponsored by a Danish newspaper and made on the occasion of the 100th birthday of Jules Verne. The trip was described in the book A Boy Scout Around the World. It took 44 days. He took the Trans-Siberian Railway and did not go by India. In 1984, Nicholas Coleridge emulated Fogg's trip, taking 78 days. He wrote a book titled Around the World in 78 Days. In 1988, Monty Python member Michael Palin took on a similar challenge without using aircraft, as a part of a television travelogue, called Around the World in 80 Days with Michael Palin. He completed the journey in 79 days and 7 hours. Since 1993, the Jules Verne Trophy has been given to the boat that sails around the world without stopping and with no outside assistance, in the shortest time. In 2009, 12 celebrities performed a relay version of the journey for the BBC Children in Need charity appeal. In 2017, Mark Beaumont, a British cyclist inspired by Verne, set out to cycle across the world in 80 days. He completed the trip in 78 days, 14 hours and 40 minutes, after departing from Paris on the 2nd of July 2017. Beaumont beat the previous world record of 123 days, set by Andrew Nicholson, by cycling 29,000 kilometers across the globe visiting Russia, Mongolia, China, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, US and a number of countries in Europe. The idea of a trip around the world within a set period had clear external origins and was popular before Verne published his book in 1873. Even the title Around the World in 80 Days is not original. Several sources have been hypothesized as the origins of the story. Another early reference comes from the Italian traveler Giovanni Francesco Gemelli Carreri. He wrote a book in 1699 that was translated into French, Voyage Around the World or Voyage du Tour du Monde. In 1871 appeared Around the World by Steam, via Pacific Railway, published by the Union Pacific Railroad Company, and in Around the World in 120 Days by Edmund Plunkett. In early 1870, the Erie Railway Company published a statement of routes, times, and distances detailing a trip around the globe of 38,204 kilometers in 77 days and 21 hours. American William Berry Fogg traveled the world, describing his tour in a series of letters to the Cleveland Leader newspaper, entitled, Round the World. Letters from Japan, China, India, and Egypt. In 1872, Thomas Cook organized the first around-the-world tourist trip, leaving on the 20th of September 1872 and returning 7 months later. The journey was described in a series of letters that were published in 1873 as Letter from the Sea and from Foreign Lands, descriptive of a tour around the world. Scholars have pointed out similarities between Verne's account and Cook's letters, although some argue that Cook's trip happened too late to influence Verne. Verne, according to a second-hand 1898 account, refers to a Cook advertisement as a source for the idea of his book. In interviews in 1894 and 1904, Verne says the source was through reading one day in a Paris cafe and due merely to a tourist advertisement seen by chance in the columns of a newspaper. Around the World itself says the origins were a newspaper article. All of these point to Cook's advert as being a probable spark for the idea of the book. The periodical Le Tour du Monde contained a short piece titled Around the World in 80 Days, which refers to 230 kilometers of railway not yet completed between Allahabad and Bombay, a central point in Verne's work. But even the Le Tour du Monde article was not entirely original. It cites in its bibliography the Nouvelle Annales des Voyages, de la Géographie, de l'Histoire et de l'Archéologie, which also contains the title Around the World in 80 Days in its contents page. The Nouvelles Annales were written by Conrad Maltebrun and his son Victor Adolphe Maltebrun. Scholars believe that Verne was aware of the Le Tour du Monde article, the Nouvelles Annales, or both, and that he consulted it and or them. Noting that the Le Tour du Monde even included a trip schedule very similar to Verne's final version. A possible inspiration was the traveller George Francis Train, who made 4 trips around the world, including one in 80 days in 1870. Similarities include the hiring of a private train and being imprisoned. Train later claimed, "Verne stole my thunder. I'm Phileas Fogg." The book page containing the famous denouement. Regarding the idea of gaining a day, Verne said of its origin, "I have a great number of scientific odds and ends in my head." It was thus that, when, one day in a Paris cafe, I read in the Siècle that a man could travel around the world in 80 days, it immediately struck me that I could profit by a difference of meridian and make my traveler gain or lose a day in his journey. There was a denouement ready found. The story was not written until long after. I carry ideas about in my head for years, 10 or 15 years, sometimes, before giving them form. In his April 1873 lecture, The Meridians and the Calendar, Verne responded to a question about where the change of day actually occurred. Since the international dateline had only become current in 1880 and the Greenwich Prime Meridian was not adopted internationally until 1884, Verne cited an 1872 article in Nature, and Edgar Allan Poe's short story 3 Sundays in a Week, which was also based on going around the world and the difference in a day linked to a marriage at the end. Verne even analyzed Poe's story in his Edgar Poe and his works. Poe's story 3 Sundays in a Week was clearly the inspiration for the Lost Day plot device.